My name is Nikhil Chanabai, and I'm facilitating today's debate. In today's debate, we're going to be asking, are markets really efficient? Is it correct that markets are truly efficient, that without capitalist competition, creativity and invention would stagnate? Would universal laziness then overtake us? And really, what about market failure, monopolies, insider trading, inequality and poverty? Is it indeed a contest amongst wolves where only one can win at the cost of the failure of everyone else? So today we are debating whether markets are really efficient. And speaking today is first Professor Yanni Rousseau, the head of the School of Economics and Business Science here at Wits, and previously from the Reserve Bank. He is our neoclassical respondent. After him, we have Mr. Bradley Borders, a PhD candidate in development economics at Wits, and he's approaching this topic from a post-Keynesian perspective. And lastly, from a Marxist perspective, we have Professor Samantha Ashman from the University of Johannesburg. There she is the director, my mistake, of the UJ partnership with the UN African Institute for Economic Development and Planning, the IDEP. So due to time constraints, and because we expect a vibrant debate on the floor today, the speakers are restricted to 15 minutes with a hard stop at 16 minutes. After that, our three speakers who have spoken each have a further 6 minutes to respond to their fellow panelists. Thereafter, we will open this debate to the floor. So, are markets really efficient? Professor?
Thank you, Session Chair, and thank you to the two panelists for joining me this afternoon. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to speak this afternoon on the topic that markets are indeed efficient, but for governments. And in the spirit of decolonialized education, I will use South Africa as my case study, but I will use examples from 2 other countries to further my case. At the outset, I have to state that although markets are indeed efficient, there are 3 non-negotiable roles for a government in any economy. So, whether you have a market economy, whether you have a centrally planned economy, there are 3 roles that a government must perform in any economy. And in my case, I do it from the perspective of the market. Firstly, a government must ensure freedom. It's necessary for a government to ensure that the people of a country can determine their own destiny. The government is responsible for freedom. Government is, of course, also responsible for order. There must be order functions such as safety and security. There must be institutional structures free of corruption for the market to function. There must be the necessary regulation, etc. And then, of course, the government has a welfare function. The first element of the welfare function is the provision of non-priceable or so-called public goods and services used by everybody, where you cannot use price as a mechanism to regulate usage of such goods. In short, the classical example is street lamps. And then, of course, the government has a welfare function for the poor, unfortunate, and destitute. But I must stress this is a limited welfare function, and it's gone completely wrong in South Africa. South African government completely misunderstands this function nowadays. And then, of course, it goes without saying that the South African government is failing desperately in its order function. We are rife by corruption, we have bad police services, all over we have bad government. We want to write a case study on how a government can get everything wrong, use South Africa. In short, we suffer the consequences of the Zuma maladministration. Mr. Zuma and his cronies stole the future of the children of South Africa, and we face an uphill battle to get it back. Hence my distrust of governments. If I had a smattering of trust in governments, just look at the Zuma administration and you will understand why my preference must be markets rather than government. And allow me to elaborate. Our economic growth rate in the second quarter of this year, minus 0.7% on an annualized basis. The country is in a recession. We have low economic growth owing to credit risk downgrade and bad government policies and no other reason whatsoever. Our unemployment rate in South Africa is 27%. In short, we have high unemployment because government makes it unattractive and nearly impossible to employ people. We have an unstable political environment. And if I say an unstable political environment, I mean in the ruling party and in the main opposition party. The ANC is at war with itself, and at the same time the Democratic Alliance is at war with itself. So, I will continue. South Africa's population estimate is 57.4 million people. Our population growth is 1.6% per annum. More than 900,000 babies are born in South Africa every year. 62% of them are registered with no fathers. Now, I'm not a medical doctor. I do not study medicine, but I do really not understand how 62% of babies can have no fathers. However, at the same time, 12 million South African children under the age of 18 are beneficiaries of the child support grant system. Incidentally, 63% of all children in South Africa under the age of 18 are such beneficiaries. My hypothesis, therefore, is that government's decision to expand child support grants, that decision is driving behavior in respect of childbirths in South Africa. A city like Randburg, not far from here, has a population of 340,000 people. We are increasing our population by more than 900,000 people per annum. In South Africa, we need to build 3 cities the size of Randburg every year just to deal with net population growth. I'm not talking about people currently living in appalling conditions. Ladies and gentlemen, it's simply not an achievable objective. So we face a demographic crisis of majestic proportions as a result of government's decision to expand child support grants to children up to the age of 17. And this is part of our unsustainable government position in South Africa. At the same time, since 2008, employment in the civil service has grown exponentially with no noticeable better service delivery for anybody in South Africa since 2008. Civil service remuneration at the current point in time accounts for 44% of tax revenue of the South African government. It's one of the highest figures in the world. It's clearly unsustainable. South Africa can no longer afford its civil service. At the same time, the government's debt as percentage of GDP increased from 23% in 2008 to 53% in 2018. In short, government borrowed money to pay civil servants and has to pay interest on its borrowing of money that it did not invest in a better future for everybody in South Africa, but merely increasing the burden on South Africa's taxpayers owing to bad policies. And incidentally, the government pays away more than 1% of South Africa's GDP with a SAPU agreement with Namibia, Botswana, Lesotho and Swaziland. Allow me to just divert for a moment. We can no longer, as South Africans, afford the SACU agreement. We can no longer pay neighboring countries more than 1% of our GDP. Incidentally, the payments to Swaziland is just about the sum total of government revenue in that country that the Swazi king uses to buy wives. And I can only speak for myself, but I'm tired of looking after the wives of the Swazi king. Other taxpayers must make up their own minds. As it is, South Africans are overtaxed owing to an incompetent government. Expect more taxes in coming years. Amongst others, I predict an increase in the VAT rate from 15% by 1 percentage point to 16% already in next year's budget. There's no revenue growth because the economy is not growing. The government has no plan to get us out of the cul-de-sac and keeps on making promises. This week there was a promise that all grant payments should be doubled for 6 months. Ladies and gentlemen, that will amount to 90 billion rands. 90 billion rands that the government simply doesn't have. So we are heading for a fiscal cliff. This government is running out of money. I do not want to dwell on the fiscal cliff. I've written on it extensively. I then have to use the examples that other countries did or are doing to avert the fiscal cliff. And this is the point where South Africa is at the moment. The Irish Republic after 2018 cut government, Irish Republic after 28, the international financial crisis, cut government expenditure by 19 billion euros and reduced civil service remuneration, reduced on average 19%. People simply got 19% lower salaries. Argentina currently in a financial crisis. Borrowing from the IMF, interest rates at the moment in Argentina 60% per annum. I can continue. This is what governments do to people. So I have a long list of steps what the South African government can do to avert a fiscal cliff. 1. Allow private businesses to use the market mechanism to stimulate growth. Give policy certainty about issues such as the national health insurance, mining investment, land expropriation, wealth tax, etc. Reduce the size of the cabinet. I'm sure not even Mr. Ramaphosa knows the names of all the cabinet ministers, all the deputy ministers and their portfolios. I certainly don't, despite my best efforts. The government should only purchase vehicles manufactured in South Africa for the government vehicle fleet. There's no reason for government ministers to be in 3 million rand Range Rovers. They can be as bad on the roads in proudly South African Fortuners. They can still run over us, but at least proudly South African. Give away non-performing state-owned enterprises like SAA. It will be cheaper to park the planes on airports abroad and wash them than to try and fly them, if you think that's a vanity project. Stop all forms of bonus payments at SOEs, SARS and the likes. South Africans want service, not overpayment of officials employed by the government. We are tired of this government. Eradicate state corruption. Take decisive action in response to the Zondo and Nugent commissions. What worries me, though, is that academics like myself and politicians have ideas about business without ever having to risk 1 rand of their own money in a small business. The entrepreneurs working in the money are the unsung heroes of this economy, but they suffer bureaucratic oversupply. So we have overregulation of businesses. Decriminalize prostitution and give prostitutes the protection of the legal system in South Africa. Yes, Decriminalize dagga. We can allow markets to work, get the government out of it. Governments have no role to play. Then, small businesses face the full cost of labor that government and academics do not understand. Things like salaries, bonuses, leave, the opportunity cost of sick leave, the opportunity cost of unreliability, such as people not showing up for work, opportunity cost of expensive employment and dismissal processes, the opportunity cost of strikes. It's not surprising with our labour legislation in South Africa that labour is replaced by capital, and we are suffering a 27% unemployment rate. Get the government out of the system. I'm summarising therefore my argument. Governments are indeed efficient. Markets are indeed efficient, but governments distort markets. Should get out of it. Allow entrepreneurs to run their businesses for the benefit of the people. Decriminalize things like prostitution, dagga, so that the market can regulate these things and that these people have protection. Prostitutes in South Africa have no protection whatsoever. So, in short, governments have very limited roles to play in markets. As I've said, their roles are ensuring freedom, ensuring order, a welfare function that the market cannot perform. Unfortunately, the South African government is failing us dismally. We need the market to work again. Thank you very
much. Bradley?
So I'm representing post-Keynesianism today. It would have been Professor Padiati, which would have been a much better option, but he's busy, so you've got the second choice. Okay. So I'm passionate about John Maynard Keynes, and I'm passionate about post-Keynesian economics. And post-Keynesian economics, if we ask the question, are markets efficient? The post-Keynesian questions is, do markets lead to full employment? Okay, which is another way of saying, in the paradigm of the marginal analysis, of neoclassical analysis, with a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve, price on the vertical axis and quantity on the other axis. It's another way of saying, does price adjust to clear the quantity? Okay? So, we've got 35% unemployment in this country. Is it a case that by just allowing wages to fall sufficiently, that the market would absorb the 35% unemployment? That's 35% by the expanded definition. The neoclassical economists have this sleight of hand of saying that there's such a thing as voluntary and involuntary unemployment. And the difference between the 7% official rate and the 35% is so-called people sitting in voluntary unemployment. I'm not so sure I believe in voluntary unemployment. So the answer to that question from the post-Keynesian perspective is no. Okay? So if I can just ask the question, what are post-Keynesian scholars? They are scholars of Keynes who are not involved in trying to fit Keynes back into the neoclassical paradigm, into a laissez-faire paradigm. Okay? Instead, they are focused on investment. Okay? And this I cannot emphasize enough, because too much of the debate between the left and the right is between the right, who doesn't want to spend, as in doesn't want to engage in consumption spending, because most of what Professor Rousseau is talking about is consumption spending. And then those on the left who say, no, we do want to engage in consumption spending. The post-Keynesians focus on investment, okay? And one of the fundamental reasons why there should be investment from a Keynesian point of view and from a post-Keynesian point of view is that Keynes discovered it himself. He was a speculator up to 1929, and then with the crash of 29, he lost his shirt, like almost everyone else. And then he changed his thinking. And he changed his thinking to invest in companies that had an income. So what is the price of an investment asset? It's the net present value of future income stream. The problem is, as Keynes points out, we don't know what the future income stream will be. We don't know who's going to run South Africa 5 years from now, 10 years from now. We don't know whether there's going to be a financial crisis or a revolution. We don't know. So investors have to guess. They don't have to guess because their calculators are not working properly. Their calculator cannot help them. They have to guess. And when they guess, they guess with animal spirits. They either decide, I'm feeling positive, I'm feeling optimistic, or I'm feeling pessimistic. And asset prices can go up and down like a yo-yo. And so Keynes said, we cannot allow this situation. Investment markets and post-Keynesian Hyman P. Minsky, by extension, said financial markets are the Achilles heel of capitalism. This is where capitalism is at its weakest. Okay, we cannot just allow laissez-faire, have your collateral debt obligations, have all your fancy instruments, and then the entire system collapses in one heap. We cannot allow that. We have to have a big portion of investment being government investments. Okay, and Minsky points out. Minsky is a great post-Keynesian economist. Minsky points out that when government investment as a percentage of total investment in the Keynesian era, the era from 1945, and it started to break down in the late 60s, early 70s. In that era, you had high levels of government investment and you had a stable economy. By the time 2008 comes around, you have low levels of government investment, massive levels of private investment, and an unstable economy. Likewise, if you have high levels of government debt as a percentage of total debt, you've got a stable economy. If you've got high levels of private debt, as we had in the run-up to 1929, and again the run-up to 2008, you have an unstable economy. So therefore, for the sake of stabilizing the economy, not because of some airy-fairy thing of wanting to feed babies, just for the sake of stabilizing the economy, for no other reason. If we don't even have to go into humanitarian issues. It's foolhardy to have low levels of government spending and government investment. Okay. So so that's the other aspect of post-Keynesian thought that I want to focus on is the question of national versus international. I'm so sick and tired of hearing it's a global world, we have to get used to it. No, we don't have to get used to it, okay? It was a global world in 1914, and by 1945 it wasn't a global world anymore, okay? And we're in that position now. Capitalism has relentlessly extended itself to the point where capital can move anywhere in the world, factories can be shifted anywhere in the world, and the solution is now to say, oh, well, people must be allowed to migrate anywhere in the world. What a nightmare scenario we're talking about. And Keynes in the 1920s and the 1930s said, no, we need to focus on the national economy. I'd like to read you an address that he gave in Ireland. I think it's in 1933. He goes to Dublin and he addresses the university in Dublin. And now you must remember, Ireland has suffered under the yoke of British imperialism for centuries. Okay, and Keynes goes there and he gives an essay, address, National Self-Sufficiency, where he says, you know what, I'm with you guys. Okay, I'm with you. You want to throw off the yoke of imperialism, I'm with you. He says, advisable domestic policies might often be easier to encompass if the phenomenon known as capital flight could be ruled out. Okay? Now, from 1945 in the Keynesian era, the IMF and the World Bank cooperated with national states to encourage them and to help them keep their capital in their countries. Okay? It was in this environment that the great welfare states were constructed. Capital could not flow internationally. He goes on, but experience is accumulating that remoteness between ownership and operation, what is historically symbolized for you in Ireland by absentee landlordism, is an evil in the relations between men, likely or certain in the long run to set up strains and enmities which bring to naught the financial calculation. Take as an example the relationship between England and Ireland. The fact that the economic interests of the two countries has been for generations closely intertwined has been no occasion or guarantee of peace. It may be true, I believe it is, that a large part of these economic relations are of such great economic advantage to both countries that it would be most foolishly reckless to disrupt them. But if you owed us no money, if we had never owned your land, if the exchange of goods were on a scale which made the question one of minor importance to the producers in both countries, it would be much easier to be friends. I sympathize, therefore, with those who would minimize rather than those who would maximize economic entanglement between nations. Ideas, knowledge, science, hospitality, travel, these are the things which should of their nature be international. But let goods be homespun wherever it is reasonably and conveniently possible. And above all, let finance be primarily national. So, on this question of international versus national, most people have heard of Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century. Absolutely brilliant analysis. Absolutely brilliant analysis. He has two laws of capital, how capital accumulates over time. Okay, they are global laws. Okay, and he shows globally one picture. Okay, the problem with that is that he proposes one global solution, a global wealth tax. Now, with all respect to my learned colleague at the table on the far side, Marx wrote about the idea of workers of the world uniting in 1848, I think it was. Well, it's 160 years later, and they haven't done a very good job of uniting. Okay, but that's not to say that socialist countries have not been successful. Okay, and that brings me to this guy, James Galbraith. He was here yesterday, and he's been at the other conference that's taking place on campus as well. He's a post-Keynesian scholar, and unlike Piketty, he drills down to wage rates, and he shows that 95% of inequality can be traced to wage inequality. Income inequality, which includes shares as well. Okay, so 95% of inequality in America in the 1990s came from massive income in the IT sector and in the investment sector. In the 2000s, it was largely the military-industrial complex, while America was engaging in imperialism for a change, surprise, surprise, and finance. Okay. Why is this so important? Because it gives a tool to national governments to form a social compact. The capitalist is sitting around the corner. He can't take his capital out. Okay? He has to negotiate with you. As opposed to a neoliberal world, if you don't play ball, if your wage rates are too high, he just takes it somewhere else. And you can form a compact, and the government has a role to play to say what industries do we need to support. In South Africa, what we've had with 24 years of neoliberalism is the finance sector has done extremely well. The real estate sector, the banking sector, the consumption sector, shopping centres and retailers. These are not industries, are capital-intensive industries. They do not employ masses of people, okay? And because of neoliberalism, we've neglected production. We've neglected agriculture, mining, and manufacturing, okay? And if we ignore neoliberalism and we say we're going to focus on building industries that can employ the masses of South Africans, that's the solution. And if we, I don't think he was necessarily the author of it, but I have to give him credit. Jacob Zuma, 2.5 years ago, she was up in Parliament at the opening Parliament, and he addressed a major shift in economic policy, which was just lost in all of the screaming from the EFF. Okay, it was the 9-point plan. It was a shift from a consumption-focused policy. Neoliberalism is focused on the consumer. Okay, to a production-focused, supporting production. Okay, and shortly after that came the idea of black-led industrialization. Now, unfortunately, I think the ANC has laryngitis, okay? Because all we hear from them is echoing of EFF policy. But the fact is, the ANC has the policy for South Africa, which is industrial policy, black-led industrialization at a national level. And I would suggest that that's within the Keynesian paradigm, and I would suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that that's the way to address the economic problems in South Africa. Thank you.
Samantha Ashman.
Hello, it's very nice to be here. Before I say what I'm going to say about the market, I do think this is actually quite a good event in the sense that it's kind of how economics should be taught. Because economics should really be taught we have these different perspectives, we have these different approaches, they've got kind of different assumptions, they've got different analyses, they've got different conclusions, and that we should teach economics in this kind of way, so that we have these competing paradigms, and students, you get the opportunity to learn what they are and to make up your mind about which you think is the best. And when we talk about pluralism in economics, that's what we mean. And so I think this kind of fits with the spirit of the event. And I think it's important for me to say thank you for coming, particularly Yami, because often what we call neoclassical or mainstream economics don't want to come and engage with people. In fact, there's a debate in economics, the Cambridge Capital controversy, which is probably the most important debate that exists in economics. But actually, it's the only real debate which exists in economics, because it's the only time the mainstream really replied to the heterodox critiques. So that is important to say, I think. But let me get to markets, because we don't have that much time. So markets, if you're an economics student, you're going to learn that markets are efficient, that all markets clear spontaneously, that there's the efficient markets hypothesis. You're going to learn one way or another that markets are the only show, really should be the only show in town. Because markets are efficient, you may hear that governments are inefficient and so on. There isn't really a debate, and that's one of the problems in economics. But the question that we're talking about today about markets is much broader than simply economics. It's about the whole debate on the television. Every time you see the news, there'll be some report at the end of the news, the stock market's gone up, it's gone down, it's like the weather, it's natural, it's unfortunate, there's not really very much we can do about it. We're all inculcated, whether you're an economist or not, with the idea that markets are natural. They are the only way that societies have ever been run, they are the only way that societies can ever be run. You know, my mum will tell you that, and she knows nothing about mainstream economics. That's because of the way in which these kind of ideas govern society. There's an American cartoon, I hope that's not too Eurocentric of me, but you will have probably seen it, called The Flintstones, which is set in the world of dinosaurs, and they live in a nuclear family, and they buy things from the shop, and you read back, even in a humorous way, that markets are the natural normal way. So, I want to challenge that idea and make 3 points about markets. But let me say firstly, normally when you have this conversation, there's generally someone who says, but my phone is cheaper today than it was 5 years ago, and it's probably better. Doesn't that show that markets are good? Now, I'm not saying to you that there isn't a single example that we could, of a market that works in a way today where there's technological innovation and that produces, that drives down the prices of food. I'm not saying that. I'm sure that we can all talk about lots and lots of different examples of that. We should also say that actually one of the major ways that people improve the production of their good and the way they drive down prices is often through because somebody somewhere works harder or longer. But we don't normally say that. Okay, but we should recognise that, and that you should think about when you're looking about the commodities that you buy. Behind every commodity that you buy, there's a story. There's a production story about who made it and how they made it. And you know, there's a bit in Marx where he says the grapes on the shelf don't have a voice, but if they did have a voice, they could tell you. And you know, table grapes come from Brazil. There's also, you know, the stories about the niche, the labour process in Brazil. But anyway, I could go on. So I want to make 3 points in my time I've got. I want to talk about history, the importance of history for understanding markets. I want to talk about crisis and crises, and the importance of crises for understanding markets. And I want to talk about the everyday dysfunctions of most markets. Okay, they're my 3 points. So I need to go quickly. But one of the problems with mainstream economics, it is ahistorical. You will learn, it's not only economics, you will learn that markets are spontaneous, that markets are natural, that markets are governed by consumer preferences, and that because consumer preferences govern the market, that in some way that means that markets meet people's needs, because consumers channel their preferences into the economy. Okay, this is simply not true. We need a distinction between markets and market society. So markets have existed in all sorts of societies, you know, throughout history, where people trade the surplus product over what they need, their immediate needs. These are a very common feature of lots of societies, hundreds of years. But they're societies where most people are peasants. And most people get there, they live off the land, they have access to the means of production. So they trade, there's a small surplus which is from time to time traded on markets or luxury goods. That's different from a market society where all our needs are met by buying commodities, by buying and selling things. Okay, so you and I, none of us can live without a market. All our food, all our clothes, where we live, everything about us we have to buy. I mean, maybe one of you have got a garden and you grow a few mealies, right? But that's going to be about it. We are completely dependent. We live in a market society. We're completely dependent on the market to meet our everyday needs, and that's the dominant logic of the economy. But actually, it's not really about markets. It's actually about commodities. It's about making commodities, buying and selling commodities. And some people own and control that process of making commodities, and other people just have to work in order to live. So we don't get to say how the commodity is made or what the nature of the commodities is at all. They just have to make it. So I've already introduced the world of work several times. Mainstream economics does not discuss the world of work. It's a black box because we have markets which work efficiently. We have consumer preferences. We don't really need to look into the world of work. We're not too interested in the world of work. I think we ought to be interested in the world of work. How do these markets do not arise? This market society has not arisen spontaneously or naturally. Market societies have been created. They've been created through, in a short, primitive accumulation and colonialism. Primitive accumulation means if you want people to work, you want to make something to sell it for money, you've got to have people to work for you. If they've got land and they can look after their own needs, they may not want to work for you. So there's a historical process where people have systematically driven off the land so that they have to work for somebody else. That's the process of primitive accumulation, which is actually ongoing. It's not something which is finished. It's a feature of the global economy today. Colonialism is the means by which this process of primitive accumulation has been achieved in large parts of the world. And we know it. Everyone in this room knows it, because you probably did it at school, or you've heard about it. You know, when you think about things like taxes, the point about colonial taxes is that they monetise the economy. You've got to pay a tax in money, that means you've got to go to work to earn the money to pay the tax, which means you've got to stop earning your existence from the land. It's one of the main drivers of colonialism. So we've got primitive accumulation, we've got colonialism, we've got slavery. Remember, slavery is actually essential to the creation of global market society, global capitalist society. Is this about, I'm moving way beyond consumer preferences already. I'm entering a world of violence and dispossession and state power and all sorts of nasty, nasty things which we have to understand in order to understand the world economy in which we live. Slavery is actually not taught. We don't teach slavery in the economics department where I work. I think there are people like Walter Rodney and Eric Williams. I think there are people in my faculty who think they played for Chelsea. Okay? I can defend that. Okay, right, so that's point number one, history. But you can say to me, all right, this is nasty and horrible. But once they're established, okay, are markets good? You know, all right, it may not be so good to start out with. Aren't they good once they get going, you could say. Okay, so I've got 2 points here. These are my next 2 points. I've got to look at you for the time. Crisis. Okay. In our understanding of economies, we have to have an understanding of crises, and why they happen. And they're not, to me, something which is abnormal or unusual, or just a sort of, something which happens every now and then. They're something which are built into the system. If you like, in the way the system breathes it, as humans, we breathe in and we breathe out. Actually, capitalism as a system generates crises systematically. I mean, Marx writes about it when he writes about the problem is that production is accumulation for accumulation's sake. That's the Moses and the prophets. Joan Robinson, who's also another excellent economist, she says modern capitalism has no purpose but to keep the show going. A classic example is the 1930s crisis. Industrial production in the US halved. Unemployment went from 1.5 million to 12.5 million. World trade collapsed by 60%. Countries dependent on export of primary commodities because colonialism has locked them into that role in the world economy, not because it's natural or spontaneous. It's a disaster. How is it resolved? How is that? Actually, it's a crisis of over-accumulation, to me. There's excess capacity. Not excess capacity, nothing to do with human need, but excess capacity over what's profitable for capital. Because capital produces what's profitable. So it rushed headlong into steel, into railroads, into electrical goods, into car production. It creates more productive capacity than can be used profitably. Expanding consumer credit fuels real estate and housing and construction booms. It keeps sales going for a time, washing machines, consumer durables. But when there's the realization of overcapacity and declining profit, investors panic. They panic. They pull out. They sell off. The shock is transmitted via stock markets. There's a massive crisis. It's happened more than once because it's this logic of profit, of rushing into the areas where for production, for profit. The solution is the destruction of assets. I mean, the solution to the 30s crisis was actually ultimately war and rearmament. Okay, that's a big price to pay. There's a huge human cost in that. It's what Joseph Schumpeter, another good economist, called the capitalism process of creative destruction. Sure, it's creative, but there's built into it at the same time are the destructive tendencies. The price of those tendencies is high. It's high. The Great Financial Crisis. 1 million jobs in a society with actually nearer 40% unemployment. 1 million jobs lost because of falling demand from the rest of the economy has a devastating effect on South Africa. Finally, my final point, the everyday dysfunctions of specific markets. The thing about markets is they're different, so the market for steel is different than the market for jeans. You and I don't go out on a Saturday morning, I trust, and buy 2 tons of steel, but you know, you might say, all right, okay, there's history, there's crises, but you and I on a Saturday morning, we can go to Pick and Pay and efficiently buy whatever we need, our jeans or our bread or what have you, and if you're white, you go to Woolworths. Okay, but markets, because I can't go through every market, I'm going to pick one market very, very quickly, which is the housing market. And I pick it deliberately because it's a basic social need. There's a difference between needs and wants. I think capitalism makes us want things that we don't really need. We can talk about that, but there are lots of things we all have that we don't really need. But there are things that there are basic social needs. Housing is one. We could talk about food. Food's another brilliant example. Housing's one. But capitalism will, so we can have homeless people, we can have a pile of bricks, and we can have unemployed brick workers. Capitalism will bring the bricks and the bricklayers together if it thinks it can make a profit. Not because people out there need houses. Okay? That's a destructive logic that's built into meeting all our basic social needs. So, but what in modern day capitalism, in financialised capitalism, which I don't have time to explain, it's even worse. Because what it means is, okay, if I can make a profit, I'll bring bricklayers and construction workers together with bricks and glass and cement, and I'll bring those things together. But what am I going to make? I'm going to make luxury offices. That's what I'm going to make, because that's going to get me a bigger rate of return than providing a decent 2 or 3 bedroom house for all the families across South Africa who need a decent 2 or 3 bedroom house. And it produces speculative bubbles. So if you look at South Africa, there's a thing in The Economist, between 1997 and 2008, there's an extraordinary housing bubble in South Africa. Inflation-adjusted price rises of 389%, according to The Economist. Double what's going on in Ireland. Massive. Now, is that Orange Farm? Is it Soweto? Of course it's not. That massive increase in the value of property is in the posh areas of Cape Town, it's in Sandton, and so on. And as that logic of property as a financial asset is extending and deepening, it gets even crazier. I mean, this is an example from London, but it will come here. So in London now, there's a phenomenon where people buy property and they don't even rent it out. Okay? They just leave it empty because it's a place to put your money. And you just it will appreciate in value because housing is now such a brilliant speculative market, and you don't even rent it out. So as well as homeless people and piles of bricks and unemployed brick workers, you have empty houses. Not just no houses, empty houses that it doesn't even make sense for you to rent out. They're better to you as a financial asset. And that kind of logic works through market after market after market. And that's why we need something else.
Thanks for that, Sam. That was inspirational. So, now for the response. Prof?
In all fairness, I went first. Perhaps I should respond last.
Bradley, are you willing to come up now?
Yes.
Are you ready?
Now, am I responding? Look, Yanni went first, so I did respond to him. So I must respond to Samantha, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
And if you have any other response.
Yes, okay, well, seeing as I'm wearing a post-Keynesian hat, I mean, that's actually the hat that I'm here wearing, so I'll wear it properly, and say that the housing example is a very good one. And we are accustomed to think, capitalism has got us accustomed to thinking of certain things as good, okay? One of the things that irritates the living daylights out of it is this thing in South Africa where if the rand is strong, the world loves us. The world loves our president, and he loves our government, and he loves us, and everything is well in the world. Well, let me tell you who doesn't think that. Southeast Asia, okay? Southeast Asia. So if you look at the Reserve Bank and how it manages assets, okay? You essentially have two types. You have volatility on the exchange rate, okay, like we have here, because we're so Springalied into supporting a free-floating rand. Or you have Southeast Asia, most Southeast Asian countries, where the exchange rate is relatively stable. Sorry, and then you have in South Africa, then you have relatively stable reserves. The reserves don't move terribly much, okay? And then you have Southeast Asia, which has relatively stable exchange rate movements, and the reserves are moving up and down. Why? Because every time the currency strengthens, the country is concerned about production. It's not concerned about consumption. Okay? It's concerned about production. So every time the currency strengthens, they print. It's very easy. Stiglitz pointed this out. You can do it. They print their own currency, sell it, and buy foreign exchange. Okay? And drive the exchange rate down, so that you have a low and stable exchange rate. Okay, so which of course it reigns in consumption because things are more expensive with the more competitive exchange rate, but it makes production more competitive, and the whole country's function on production. Getting back to your excellent South African and British example, why is everyone loves the idea that a house in Chelsea, in London, that used to cost 3 times an annual salary, now costs 30 times an annual salary? Because the economy is geared towards neoliberalism. Britain produces bugger all. We're told that Margaret Thatcher was so great for business. No, Margaret Thatcher was not great for business. Margaret Thatcher was terrible for the real economy. She was great for the City of London. Okay? And so when you've got a financially fueled economy, private lending goes up and up and up, like it has in South Africa. The graph of the correlation of the extension of private lending and property prices is about as close to 1 as it's possible to get. It's very, very close. Okay, so you're fueling the economy with debt to buy, and the property price is going up and up and up and up, and you have all this. You have construction and whatever other things related to this, but you've got no production. Now, I would suggest that's a bad idea. I would suggest that Southeast Asia and even China is the model to follow, because it's production focused, and in a production focused economy, if you have if you're driving if you're focusing on production, not consumption, you don't have the explosion of real estate to the same extent. I mean, it's not quite true in China now, but I would suggest that's a general principle. Yeah.
Prof, I think it's your turn now. Oh no, Prof, you already do so. If you're willing to, you want to come now? Like, I don't know, who wants to go first?
I said I go last.
Alright, thank you, Sam.
Yeah, I'll probably be a bit less because I'm not really, but it's fine. I'll make a couple of points about Bradley because, as you'll see, I mean, there's quite Marxists and post-Keynesians have got quite a lot in common, which I think you can probably tell in what we said. Keynes, I think, was actually a brilliant economist in lots of ways, and he says different things at different times. But one of my favourite quotes from Keynes is he says that he's in favour of the socialisation of investment and the liquidation of the financiers. Okay, I am definitely in favour of the socialisation of investment and the liquidation of the financiers. So in that sense, I'm a Keynesian. I think that, I mean, there is an important difference between Keynes and Marx. I think Keynes, as Bradley says, tends to focus on, quite rightly, both Keynes and Marx focus on the question of investment and what's driving investment and understanding investment as a way to understanding an economy, rather than starting from consumer choice and consumer preferences. So they're both completely right about that. That's a kind of fundamental fault line, it seems to me. But I suppose Keynes just does tend to stress investors' feelings, in positive and negative cycles. So that there's a sort of psychological dimension to it, whereas I think with Marx it's much more systematic. That capitals are compelled on the pain of competition to act in certain sorts of ways, irrespective of their individual psychology. But that's a good debate to have. I think I didn't realise that Yanni was going to be such a crowd pleaser. I confess, with his bashing of the South African government, but because of the period that we've been through of state capture, that's a fairly easy way to go. It's a fairly easy card to play, given how gross the Zuma regime has been. I mean, I think we do need to look a bit more deeply at state capture, and we need to look at the trajectory of the ANC. I mean, a liberation movement with many honourable goals, with many, with a powerful history. And there's a debate about the Freedom Charter, but many admirable aspirations in the Freedom Charter, and a very, very powerful mass movement that just destroyed apartheid. So how do you get from that to a project which is really based upon the narrow promotion of a small layer of black capitalists? It's a project to change the colour of capitalism rather than to actually change capitalism itself. And then how do you that sort of diminishing of the aims of the liberation movement is something I think we should look at, and that's how we should understand state capture. And then the idea that let's use the state to in a context of very weak accumulation where you've got very powerful incumbents, otherwise called white monopoly capital. It's hard for black capital to break in. Actually, the state and state corruption becomes one way that you break in that context. Mining licenses becomes one. Rather than having a proper serious debate about coal and the ecological crisis and so on that's taking place, it becomes for a small number of the black elite, how do I get my contract? How do I enter into mining? How do I enter into the accumulation regime? And obviously I will go on, I will probably treat my black workers not very differently to how white monopoly capitalists treated them throughout the colonial and the apartheid period. So I think it's important for us to really examine state capture in a bit more depth. But Yanni was saying markets are good and states are bad. But in a way, I wasn't really saying that the opposite. I wasn't really saying that the state's always positive. I think there are very many positive roles of the state can play, and the state does play. But if we want to understand, let's look at the role of the state in the evolution of the South African economy. Here, actually, you see a state project to aid accumulation. That's what you really see, and that's how we should understand the evolution of South African political economy. From the colonial and the apartheid period. Obviously, the sort of primitive accumulation that I talked about in my opening talk, so mass dispossession, land alienation, denial of political rights, and in pursuit of extraction of wealth, crucially through mining, and the establishment of the migrant labour system and all that's meant for the underdevelopment of parts of South Africa which remain underdeveloped and haven't been improved by post-apartheid economic policy. But also in the apartheid period, look at the state intervention in the apartheid period. There's an enormous industrial policy in the apartheid period, but it's not aimed at including the majority of the population. That's why we still have this legacy of effectively 40% excluded from the economy. And the legitimate anger about that. Because the state-owned enterprises, look at what Eskom does, look at what Steel does, and then later what Sasol does. Eskom provides cheap electricity to the mines. The network, which is not to provide electricity to black holes. That's why in 1994 the ANC did dramatically increase electricity provision. It comes with a price because it's commodified. There's a sting in the tail. You get electricity eventually. Eventually you get electricity, but it's commodified, so if you can't afford to pay for it, it's not such a great gain. You can't afford to pay for it because it's a commodity. And it's that commodified logic which drives things, and I'll have to do for now, I think.
And finally, Prof.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, after Bradley and Samantha have spoken, I have about 3 pages of notes and no structure. So, Samantha, thank you for calling me a crowd pleaser. I will report that to my wife later this afternoon. So let me try and start somewhere other than talking about my wife. At this point in time, I must make the general remark that South Africa needs a government of national healing. It's the only way we are going to get out of the mess we are in at the moment. The government of national healing will have elements of a government of national unity. The only way we are going to get out of this mess is to put all political parties in cabinet, because they will watch one another and not allow the things that we've seen happening to happen again. I also have to stress that there must be a strong focus on eradicating inflation, as I am against inflation. Inflation is ungood. And this is the one point where I do disagree strongly with Bradley, wants to use an ever declining or depreciating exchange rate to protect local investment, which is not a sustainable policy. Where I do agree though with Bradley is that we do need reindustrialization. And if that then moves me from being a new classical economist to being a post-Keynesian economist, I would gladly be one on that score. We need to make investment attractive again. But we need to remove the government impediments to it. It is really tough to be a businessman in South Africa. Let me give you one example. Bradley is indeed a businessman. I should not speak on Bradley's business skills and acumen. In South Africa, you're a small business, any size business, and you work for the government. One, they do not pay your invoice. Two, once you've issued the invoice, you have to pay VAT on that invoice at month end. Three, if you have a VAT claim against SARS, they simply do not pay your VAT claim, because SARS officials are paid bonuses on gross collections. That's a gross system, mind you, not gross collections. So you don't get your invoice paid, you pay your VAT, and you don't get your VAT refund. You think anybody wants to invest in South Africa and be a business person in this country?
No.
We need a government of national healing to fix this country. And then, so, Bradley, we have elements we do agree. Then, I've made the point that politicians cannot be trusted, and that is where I disagree from Samantha. I'd rather have minimum government and put my risk in the market than trust the government and put my risk in them. The government has let me down more than the market, frankly. I must make the point about financialization that Samantha has made. It must be very clear, ladies and gentlemen, that nobody ever in the history of the world has been under any obligation to borrow any money from anybody else. Not from a bank, not from another individual, from no one else. People, however, do borrow money because they want instant gratification. They do not want to save and buy something after a period of time. They want to buy it now because they want instant gratification and instant consumption. And then after borrowing, they blame that on other people. Secondly, people borrow because they want to live better sooner. You want to buy a car because you live better with a car. So what do? You borrow someone else's money. Whether you do it directly or through a financial institution, you borrow someone else's money to buy a car because you want to live better sooner. However, nothing prevents you not to borrow any money, save sufficient money, live debt-free, and buy once you've saved enough money. There's nothing wrong with such an approach. And then you have no financialization to blame for any of your hardships or no financial institution to blame. Simply save sufficiently, live debt-free if you don't like financial institutions. It's a very simple solution. I know quite a number of people who live debt-free and quite happily. They did not have the most sexy jeans, to use Samantha's example, or the most expensive, most up-to-date cell phone, but they lived quite content, quite happily, avoiding consumerism that Samantha very clearly warns us about, which in her model is something we should not do. So to avoid consumerism, stop borrowing other people's money and save until you can afford to buy something. By the way, and to buy something, you need markets to function to ensure supply of what you want. Thank you very much.
So finally, I'm going to open the debate to the floor so we can engage with our panelists. Please be sure to keep your questions short and to the point so as many people as possible can participate. Yes, in the front.
Okay, so my question.
Just wait for mine. Yeah, I'll take 3 questions. No, go for it.
So my question is, from whose point of view are we having this discussion? Because if you say that someone should save until they can buy, well, first of all, they have to be earning enough money for them to be able to earn for their needs, like to buy their rent and their groceries and pay their school fees, and still have enough money to save on the side and to live debt-free. We really need to be considering who's this market that we're talking about, and who's the consumer that you're worried about, and who's interested in taking. So, what I wanted to say is that I have actually written this. I remember we were told that we're not back. I'm not sure.
Oh, thank you, Chair. One of the things we might look at is, when you look at the trade wars that Trump declared, one would have thought that if you look at the markets, then the markets would have, we would have seen a huge sell-off at that current time. But what we saw, we began to see a huge asset buying from the market. Now, that on its own, it was a sign to indicate that actually the markets are not performing as efficiently as we want them to perform. And secondly, we have the issue of tax cuts. Now, when Trump came in and began to reduce the corporate taxes, this is what we would have expected to see happening in the market. You would have expected to see more job creation by the industrialists. But what we saw was that instead of that, there were no job that were being created at that time. So what we began to see is they began to take the money that was on their balance sheet because of those tax cuts, and they began to drive them, and instead they began to drive the stock market. Thirdly, the issue of contagion of Turkey. We know that the issue of Turkey is not because of the liquidity issues in the emerging markets, but that whole thing is because of the issues of NATO. So now what I'm trying to say is that if we're gonna say now the markets are efficient now, I think maybe we need to go back to our models, because the whole efficient market hypothesis, it does no longer apply, and we've seen that happen a number of times. And the last case would be, if you look at your property now has begun to behave like equities, of which property is not supposed to behave like an equity. Now that on its own, it shows that we have moved away from the whole concept of efficient market hypothesis.
Thank you. Hal, do you want to respond?
Take some more of it.
Oh, okay, all right.
We've talked such a lot.
Okay, Charles, and then the side.
Can I just point out that the question today was, are markets efficient, right? And I think Amanda pointed it out that Yanni didn't really answer the question. All he told us was that the politicians aren't working properly. Sorry. So actually, to say that just because the politicians don't work, and then therefore the market must be efficient, is a bit of a fallacy. So it hasn't really, to me, with all due respect, proven anything.
Thank you. I agree with you. I don't think what Yanni has presented is a full story and a balanced account, because he's put the blame on the government. He's very silent on those CEOs who are earning 100 million per annum, who are earning 69,000 a day, and he comes back and says it's difficult to run a business in South Africa. Is it difficult to run a business in South Africa when you can earn that amount? Between 2000 and 2010, more than 100 billion went to share buybacks and were not put into productive capabilities of businesses like R&D and increasing wages of workers. Now you come back and say it's difficult to run. Can you please give a balanced account and not play need to look at their conscience because of this inequality are business people, because they are taking money for themselves. Can you please let us forget about trickle down economics? It has not worked and it will never work. Thank you.
Okay, in the middle. Here. All right.
Hello, my name is Claire. I'm from the University of Stellenbosch. So the question is whether the markets are effective, which we can agree is an evaluative question. But I don't feel that any of the panelists actually set out the evaluative criteria. So when you're saying that something, whether it's effective or not, what is the end point? So I'd like each of the panelists to make that clear, whether it is to increase GDP, whether it's to reduce inequality, chicken in every pot, what, because there are different things and there's different routes to get to those ends.
Can I have one more question? Yes, sir.
Hi, I just wanted to start off with a comment for Yanni. I think you are completely just detached from the South African perspective. You have no idea, as a black South African, it sounds like the market does not take us into perspective and we are distanced from this market. How can you stand there and so confidently say that it is a choice for people to take loans out to take care of their families? We come from black families, single households where our parents take our to educate us. In this very school in which you are the head of Udon, you sit there and you tell us that this is by choice, that we drive these cars and we go to these places to work for capitalism and extort ourselves and tire ourselves just by choice. I will never understand that. My question to you, one of the comments that you said, the government makes it impossible to employ people. So I'd like you to elaborate on how does the government make it impossible to employ people in South Africa?
Thank you very much. I think we have about 5 minutes between the three of us. So, in short, apparently my remark about the fact that people are under no obligation to borrow is extremely disliked. It's a factual remark. It is a factual remark in as much as people borrow, as all of you have responded to my remark, people borrow to improve their standards of living and to change the time span over which they get gratification or payback, which is exactly what I've said. The choice is people borrow because they want to change the period of gratification or payback, which is exactly what I said, which you have confirmed in your responses to me. The point I make is nobody is under any obligation to borrow. And if people restructure their consumption, their borrowing needs will change, which is exactly what you've said and what you've attacked me for. But people borrow and therefore build up commitments because they want to change the feedback period of gratification and consumption. So that's my first remark. Then there was a remark about being silent about CEOs being overpaid, which is not true. I did make the point that the CEOs of state-owned enterprises in this country are overpaid and should not get bonuses. I went as far as to say they should not get bonuses. I did not make the point here. I've made the point before, and if I've omitted to make it here, I do apologize. I've repeatedly made the point before that South African CEOs are overpaid, and that if remuneration committees of South African enterprises do not have the common sense to rein in the exorbitant remuneration of CEOs and other executive directors, the government has an obligation to increase the tax rates on such CEOs. I've also advocated before a debate on a maximum wage in South Africa. We have a debate on a minimum wage, but what we need is a debate on a maximum wage above which any further remuneration of executives should simply be taxed away with the 100% tax rate. If CEOs cannot exercise, restrain themselves, the government should simply tax away exorbitant salaries. We can have a debate above which remuneration level. But I have advocated that before. If I failed to do that this afternoon, I do apologize. But yes, I fully agree. CEOs of big South African companies are enormously overpaid. Their salaries do not reflect their risks. But please, we only had 5 minutes. There were other points that I wanted to respond to, but let me pass on to that.
Okay, I want to address the question relating to Trump's protectionism in the markets, the stock markets going up, which it wasn't supposed to do according to the market, and then the tax cuts not resulting in direct investment, instead going to higher share prices. Okay, so I would say that this is a good example of the fact that the even the stock market doesn't believe in that endless global neoliberalism just results in more and more benefits. Because here's a country that's implementing protectionist programs and the stock market's improving. We've had other examples of that during the Asian crisis. I think it was Malaysia took the recommendations from the IMF, tore it up and threw it in the bin and did its own thing. And it was one of the better performing economies in the region. Okay? Controversially, seeing as Yanni said a few controversial things, let me say a controversial thing. Okay? The subject of my PhD is the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Okay? And basically, I'm not going to say it in the PhD, but I'll say it now. I think that, and I am a black nationalist, not because I'm black, but because I live in South Africa and I'm a nationalist, so that makes me a nationalist of the South African context, okay? The fact of the matter is that Afrikaner nationalism, Afrikaners were in a similar position. They were screwed over by international capital. The entire might of the British Imperial Army came down on them and destroyed their farms, and there was a massive poor white problem, okay? And they tried neoliberalism for a while. The first president was a Rainbow Nation president. His name was Louis Botha. He was married to an English woman, and he talked about non-racialism, by which he meant that the English and Afrikaners get along. Okay, and then after that, the great intellectual internationalist Jan Smuts. Okay, and after that, the analogy falls apart. But the point is that I'm actually Obviously, I'm not a fan of the racism of that period. But the problem is that the thing is that the English were just as racist. It wasn't, Afrikaners didn't invent racism. Okay? But what they did invent, not invent, but what they did get right was they tore up the neoliberal playbook, the laissez-faire playbook. And they had a buy Afrikaner policy. Okay? This was 10-15% of the population decided they were going to buy from their fellow Afrikaners. Can you imagine what would happen if black South Africans decide they're going to buy from black-owned companies? Okay? Now, they formed companies. In the state, they formed Eskom. Outside the state, they formed, if you are Afrikaans, you banked with Volkskas, you bought your newspapers from Naspers, you bought your cigarettes from Rembrandt, okay? And I'm not disputing that they had the benefit of oppressing 80% of the population. But aside from that, they didn't confiscate English-owned business, but they built from the ground up Afrikaans businesses. And I think that that's the model, not necessarily that particular model, but the model of a national upliftment program, which is run in the benefit of the majority. I think that's the way to go. And the stock markets will just, you'd be surprised at all the stock markets will. The economists will tell you it's a terrible idea, and the stock markets will go.
Okay, so a couple of points. But on this question of staying debt-free, see what we have, that's starting from the individual. So the question of how you understand the financial system and debt and so forth is to start from the individual and individual choices. In a way, everything I've been trying to say is that we don't understand history and the economy and financialisation if we start from individual consumer preferences. So if you've got one takeaway from today, shall I say it again? If you've got one takeaway from today, that's we don't understand things if we start from looking at the world like that. If you want to understand debt, a critical point of understanding debt is looking at the financial system and looking at how they systematically throw credit at people. And that this has increased massively. Absolutely massively. And we have to say, is it therefore fair to blame all bad debt on people desperate? Should we blame the global financial crisis on the people who are desperate, who've been poor black people actually in large parts of the United States, who've been redlined, who've been denied mortgages and so forth, who took up the what then fed into the credit default swap options that spread such panic? Is it their fault? Because that's where we would go with this kind of approach. The unemployment. Is unemployment a consequence of the properties of the unemployed? Actually, that's what most of the mainstream debate in South Africa says about unemployment. Because they say it's education. You got more skills, you'd be employable, and then that would magically attract the foreign direct investment or investment necessary to create more employment in South Africa. Carefully avoiding the structure of the economy, the history that's created the structure of the economy, and the vested interests which ensure that the structure of the economy carries on as it is. Okay? Carefully avoided all those things by simply looking at individual choices. It won't work as a way to explain the economy, and it certainly won't work if you want to look at anything that's around equality or fairness or distribution. Final couple of points. I did mention that when Yanni spoke about the negative side of the state. Do remember that means privatisation. Because he's saying, markets are good, states are bad. That means privatisation. That's really what's the policy conclusion of that logic. That's what's driven privatisation. What it means more of here. I presume it means that when it comes to something like health, private medical insurance would be seen as preferable than a national health service, which was provided by the state, which is actually one of the best things the British state ever did, which created a national health service. But very final point was the question of are markets efficient and what's the criteria that you're drawing to understand efficiency. Now, there are narrow and there are broad ways that you can look at efficiency. And I was deliberately talking about trying to redefine efficiency and put it in a broad way. And I would absolutely defend that. Because here, one of the great things that we're doing is and in many of the sessions, is we're talking about what kind of economy do we want. You know, if the economy is to serve human beings, which it should do really, what kind of economy would we choose to create? And it seems to me the answer to that question has to be, the economy has to meet certain human basic needs. And which is why I chose the question of housing. We could also talk about health, we could talk about food, we could talk about these fundamental properties for human life, for human being, are messed up. They're seriously messed up. Okay, bread was another thing I was going to, we don't have much time. So we have to look a bit at, I think, the way that markets distort the provision of these basic things, and I think that's important in terms of efficiency. Now, my very, very final point is, doing that, this could be what economics is like all the time. You know, I mean, it's been quite good fun. We've talked about things which are actually really serious and important, and it's all been kind of enlivening and engaging, and, you know, maybe people have got different views and so on, but this could be the economics curriculum if we had a broader, more pluralist one.